Welcome back, everybody. You just take your seats. So welcome back. Before I introduce our next speakers, I hope you'll indulge me briefly while I maybe outline two reasons why I'm involved in the GTC. Firstly, as an intensivist, the reality which I sometimes have to remind myself is that my direct impact where I changed the course of a patient's life as an ICU clinician is actually relatively rare. It will happen a few times a year, perhaps. Whereas the opportunity to impact on hundreds or even thousands of people all around the world is something that I can achieve through engaging in a collaborative such as the GTC. And I think if you think about your own practice, I think as healthcare professionals, we do make a difference to our patients on a day-to-day basis, but those really major impacts that are perhaps life-changing or really alter the course of clinical care are actually relatively infrequent. And so from a selfish perspective, I appreciate I can achieve far more good professionally through engagement with things like GTC than I'll ever achieve as an individual clinician in my own unit. The second selfish reason to be engaged with the GTC for me personally is, as I think you may have already come to appreciate, I get to interact with some of the finest human beings on the planet. And these are people who dedicate themselves tirelessly in their own time, utilising their own resources to improve patient outcomes. And our next two presenters are great examples of that. So Jay Berry is a paediatrician from Harvard, and he's been instrumental in the relatively thankless, complex and challenging task of setting up our database. And any of you who've been involved in anything vaguely related to that in the past will have considerable respect and admiration for anyone who's prepared to lead that undertaking. Our second presenter is Hannah Zhu, who first began to contribute to this endeavour as a medical student. But that shouldn't leave you under any illusion that she was a junior member of the team. Hannah has similarly been absolutely instrumental and key to all of the undertakings of the GTC and in particular to the setup of the database. So whilst setting up a database in and of itself isn't particularly sexy, it's nonetheless crucial to everything that we do, and I'm delighted now to introduce Jay and Hannah, who will walk us through what the database can do for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. I'll have to say that I do feel very sexy when I'm working on the database. So we're delighted to be here today to talk to you about the database component for this collaborative. Over the next 30 minutes or so, Hannah and I are going to walk you through the development of this database. We're going to take you through a test run. So we're actually going to put it up on the screen so you can see this thing, and then we're going to talk a bit about the future directions of it. Now, before we get started, we just have to acknowledge all the people that have been a part of getting this database together and to actually exist. So listed here alphabetically, we have representations from clinical providers from the pediatric and the adult side, intensive care, general pediatrics, speech and language pathology, surgical care. We've got medical students, pediatric residents in training, and most importantly, we've got our database programmers, the actual people who are programming this thing to actually exist. So this database was conceived in Scotland in 2012 after a long night of excessive beverage intake and wild abandonment merrymaking. Many of us don't really remember what actually happened to get it started, but I'm going to try to put it together for you here. We all got in a room together talking about the collaborative, and we thought, how amazing would it actually be to have a central data repository of quality improvement data, health outcomes data, from patients undergoing tracheotomy across the world. Thousands of patients aggregated together in one data set that's equipped, if we layer on top of it state-of-the-art statistical analyses that would be able to distinguish with a lot of statistical power, to distinguish best practices, to distinguish which bundles of quality improvement interventions are actually working the best, and what's going on. Reports that could be generated across all the sites to benchmark yourselves against others, to tell where you are in the distribution of outcomes, et cetera. We got very, very, very excited super quickly about doing this. So David and the steering committee then charged us to go off for 1 hour and to prioritize which data elements we were actually going to include in this data set. And within 15 minutes, we had 277 different data elements that we wanted to put in, right? The general pediatricians wanted 20, the intensivists wanted 50, the surgeons wanted like 4,000, right? And we got so excited about thinking about all the learning potential and everything that could come out of the data, all the quality improvement projects, and even more the research projects that could be done from such a robust data set. And then we all took a step back and we said, holy shnikes, we've only been working on this for 15 minutes and we're already ahead of ourselves. We've got to take a step back and figure out what we're actually trying to do and whittle this down into something that's going to be manageable. And that reminded me of a recent cartoon that I read where this quality improvement officer, a manager in a hospital, got a couple people together for a meeting and he said, I just got our hospital report on tracheotomy and it identifies our biggest problem. The other guys responded, well, I recommend that we build a tracking database. We can put it on the network. The quality improvement officer said, well, would you like to hear what the problem is first? The other guy said, well, I hate to dwell on the negative, and we like databases. Well, you haven't heard what the problem is yet. How can you recommend building a database to solve it? Well, we always build a database, and we'll need coffee mugs for the project team. Well, the problem is that our hospital doesn't do trachs. Well, that could be the slogan on our mugs, says the other guy. And just as an aside, there is an American fascination with coffee mugs that has worked its way into the Global Tracheostomy Collaborative. On our website, you can purchase one of our mugs for a competitive price of $17.95 US dollar.
And the first institution to enter data on every comment gets 1 free mug.
Fantastic. Incentives. So from that meeting, we took a step back and we said we cannot ignore and never forget what we think are the true problems and issues that are driving us to put together a data set such as this. And the big thing is that despite all this wonderful quality improvement work going on all over the world that you've heard about some today, we really feel like there is a need for better data sharing. Standardization of data, measurement, outcomes, the way that patient characteristics are quantified and characterized. Across sites, we can really discern and distinguish best practices. At the same time, we realize that no one really has any time to enter data into such a tracheostomy database. When is the last time you've heard a respiratory therapist say, oh my goodness, it's the end of my day, I have an hour left over. If I only had a database to enter in data for all my patients, it would be a perfect day. We're all busy. We're trying to be at the bedside as much as possible. We have our own administrative duties and everything else that's going on. So if we're going to take on something like this and dedicate time to it, it's got to be meaningful, unequivocally meaningful. So our mindset for developing the database were as follows. First and foremost, we wanted to prioritize the feasibility of data entry for this thing. It's got to be fast, efficient, smooth. You've got to be able to get in and get out of it relatively quickly. We also thought, look, why don't we start by trying to distinguish one component of clinical care for patients undergoing tracheotomy that we feel might be manageable in terms of wrapping our heads around the data. So we elected to start with data collection around the index hospitalization for when tracheotomies performed. Not to undermine the other aspects of care, which are super important, we'll get to those later, but we felt like this is a great place to start. Within that, we wanted to emphasize the crucial core data elements that we thought were the most important to first collect across sites. Major health outcomes that the patients are experiencing, the hospital utilization associated with the tracheotomy admission, and important patient and clinical demographic characteristics which would help us case mix adjust across hospitals to distinguish true variation and quality of care. Lastly, we wanted to make the database relational. So if we start with this core database in the very beginning of just the index hospitalization, let's build the back end of it in the architecture where it can be expanded and can integrate into other databases that we want to build on top of it, right? If we expand it in that way, we can do whatever we want. If we want to build more data elements in for the initial index tracheostomy hospitalization, fantastic. If we want to build in the capability of longitudinal follow-up, after the patient has been discharged, up to 5 years, say, of health outcomes, tracheostomy complications, mortality, et cetera, health services utilization, rehospitalizations, let's do it. And along the way, let's also build the capability of having data collected on the actual quality improvement issues that are happening, right? So if Tony's going to institute some new fantastic bundle of care that's going to take his tracheostomy complications down to 0 forever, let's build in the capability of recording when that starts, the team that's involved, what they're actually doing, so that it can be entered in the database, and if we're tracking pre and post outcomes, we can do it. So from all that, we started to build a database. We actually have one, and this is what we've got. We've got a database that's web-based with ubiquitous access from any computer with internet access. You can also enter data in from your smartphone or from a tablet. You've got the capability of going in and recurrently entering in data on the same patient whenever you want. So it's not like you have to open up a patient, fill out all the data, and then store it. If you're in the operating room and you want to enter 2 data elements, the patient's name and their indication for tracheotomy, you go in and do it. If the ICU wants to come in behind you and enter in some comorbidity information, they can do it. If you've got a research assistant who wants to round things out with a chart review for tracheostomy complications at the end of the hospital stay, you can do it. Also, we wanted to prioritize and maximize the data privacy and security that are associated with the database. It's password protected. All the data are encrypted on the same level that our hospital's electronic health information is behind our firewall. We also created a way for individual sites to be able to go in. If they're uploading their data, they do it, but they can also pull it back down at any time to retrieve it and do whatever they want with it, but they're unable to do that for the other sites. And lastly, we wanted to maximize the data confidentiality. So we believe that we've created a database that meets most international standards for protected health information. And we've also created a way for different countries and sites and hospitals to be able to go in and enter in different levels of patient health information, protected health information, depending on what they may be, what they're able to do. So for instance, if your hospital says, you know, we want to participate in this database, but from our ethics review board, we feel that we're unable to submit data on dates. We do not want to put in the date of the tracheotomy operation, the date of the admission of the hospitalization, the discharge, et cetera. We have a way to work around that so you don't have to do it. So here are the major data elements of the index hospitalization core data set, all right? For health outcomes, we measure in-hospital mortality, decannulation, and 6 tracheostomy complications. Accidental or failed decannulation, bleeding, obstruction, one-way valve placed with the cuff inflated, skin and stoma breakdown, and tracheocutaneous fistula. It's not to say that there are other complications out there that are important. There definitely are, but we felt it best to just prioritize these as a good place to start. In terms of hospital utilization, we measure the number of days that the patient was in the hospital, including the specific days that the patient was in intensive care. Information is collected on the timing of tracheotomy in relation to the days of admission, days of discharge, and the duration that trach is in for those who are decannulated. And also information on the discharge destination of the patient, whether they go home or, in the case of a lot in the United States and other countries, going to post-acute care facilities, skilled nursing facilities, rehab facilities, of the like. Lastly, we collect patient attributes. On the demographic level, we can distinguish whether a patient is a pediatric versus an adult patient, which is actually a little bit more tricky than you would think, because a lot of times it's not solely based on age. We do collect information on age as well as race ethnicity, which for Australia, we can distinguish different types of folks. For the clinical information in the data set, we have the reason for admission. We have an elegant comorbid conditions data collection system that Stephen totally helped us put up to speed based on ANZIG, organ system-based way to track chronic comorbid conditions across different organ systems, and we have the indication for tracheotomy. So that's in the core data set. Then in the expanded data set, this is when everyone starts to get excited about putting in more data. And a lot of the data elements that I talked about earlier in our initial meeting are now included here. We have attributes of the patient's airway, tracheostomy tube attributes, the size, the length, the type, et cetera. How many tracheostomy tube changes happen, when did they occur? More information about tracheostomy complications, other adverse events that are non-trach related, other medication adverse events or other things that happen during the hospitalization, more details on decannulation, on the use of communication valves, patient and family education, more details on discharge, and whether advanced directives were in place or not. So that's sort of a whirlwind introduction to the development of the data set, what we were thinking, and how we got to where we are. I mean, we want to be completely transparent about this process. We've tried to put this together what we think is going to be the best for everyone, but we don't know. So we've tried our best, and we hope that this works. So now I'm going to hand it over to Hannah, who's going to take you through the core portion of the data set, show you what it's like to actually impute data, and then we're going to throw up a prototype of the expanded data set, which is not quite ready to go live yet, probably ready the 1st of 2015, but just to give you a taste of what's out there.
Thank you very much, Jay. So now we're going to have a go at entering a test patient into the database. So I'm going to start with the mandatory database, and just to emphasize, this is the index admission where the patient first had their tracheostomy inserted. So we're going to select Hospital A, where protected health information such as date of birth and date of tracheostomy is allowed. And you're not a USA site here. And we're going to enter an adult patient. The date of birth is, let me just see. So 1985, October 1st. And it's a male patient, and it's not indigenous. So for the purposes of BMI, we know that this is an obese patient, and we know the BMI, so we'll enter it there. Admission information. So the patient was admitted, say, in August 1st, 2014, and this patient's admission wasn't scheduled in advance, so we'll click no. Was not admitted for surgery other than a tracheostomy, and I'm imagining a patient with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy who came in with aspiration pneumonia. So here we would put respiratory for the reason for admission and select aspiration pneumonia from this drop-down list here that branches from respiratory. And now we enter the patient's comorbidities. So within muscular dystrophy, we'll go into neurological here. And here, we would then select neuromuscular disease. And say if he had asthma as well, we go into respiratory, and we can enter that too. So now moving on to tracheostomy information. So the date of the patient's tracheostomy, say we could do August 20th, 2014. And the reason for the tracheostomy was for facilitation of ventilation. This patient has never had a tracheostomy before, so we'll click no here. And the patient did spend time in ICU and did require mechanical ventilation. This patient did survive to hospital discharge, and date of discharge we will put as October 1st, 2014. Patient was discharged to a rehabilitation hospital and was not decannulated prior to discharge. We're unsure as to whether this patient may or may not be have the tracheostomy long term, so we'll put that there. Now moving on to section D. This is for adverse events and mortality, and in the mandatory data set, we just click whether they had any of these. So, for example, if the patient had the tracheostomy tube obstruction, we'd click yes there, and hopefully he didn't have any other complications. So there we go. And in general comments, you can write anything you like here about anything else related to the patient's stay. So for example, patient loves koalas. For example, sorry, I can't spell patient. Come on. It's okay, I'm from the UK, it's jet lag. Okay, so now moving on to the expanded data set. I've pre-filled in some of this information already just to save time, and I'm just going to highlight a few key areas. So as you can see, the information from the mandatory database automatically transfers to the expanded. So we know it's an adult patient, date of birth, admission date, trach date, and discharge date, as you see here. And we know the patient didn't have a tracheostomy tube in the past, so that section doesn't open up. And there's a lot of branch logic, so whatever you fill in the mandatory determines what questions you'll get in the expanded. And now the second section is the preoperative information. Asks about ASA and Apache score if known, and patient's airway status. A few more questions here as well, because we know the patient did have mechanical ventilation. There's a few more questions to ask, more questions about that in more detail. And we know the patient did spend time in an ICU, so this opens up this section. And talks about, there's a few more questions about how long they stayed. And now this patient did have a difficult airway, so we will click yes here, which opens up more questions below. And we know the Mallampati score and the Cormack-Lehane score, so we'll put that as 4 and 3 there. And the reason for the difficult airway in this patient's case was obesity. And then we can describe that in more detail if required. And now moving on to intraoperative information. This asks for more details about who performed the trache, where it was done, what type of trach it was, how it was secured, and more details about the manufacturer name, tube type, tube size, and features. And furthermore, we have some more questions on intraoperative complications. And just to emphasize, everything in the expanded data set is actually optional, so different sites may choose to enter specific parts of this, and you're under no obligation to do all of it. Okay, now moving on to post-operative course. So this asks specifically how long the patient was in ITU after the trach was done, and whether the patient, and we know the patient required mechanical ventilation, so that asks how many days that was and how the patient was discharged on partial ventilatory support in this case. And now moving on to tracheostomy tube changes. So depending on how long the patient stays, they could have multiple tube changes, and you may not wish to enter data on all of them. So for example, if this patient had 4 tube changes, you could opt to enter data about every single tube change, and you would click this button here. But if you only wanted to enter the first one, you can also do that. And that opens that up here. So for example, this patient had his first tube change on August 27th. And this was a routine change as per local protocol. And it was done in the intensive care unit. And it was not replaced with an identical tube. If you click yes, that's fine. But if you click no, this opens up more information where you could enter details about what type of tube. And I'm not going to do that right now, but that option is there. So now the patient's tracheostomy tube at discharge. So for example, we can enter that right now. Adult, size 8, and we'll do inner cannula double lumen. So now, in terms of adverse events, in the mandatory data set, we enter that the patient had a tracheostomy tube obstruction, and that is transferred here as well. And it asks us how many times it was obstructed. So let's say once, and then you can enter more data about that obstruction. So say that occurred on September 10th, and it was due to a mucus plug, and the patient suffers from transient hypoxia. So there you go. So we also have a section on major unanticipated adverse events that are not directly related to tracheostomy. These could be anything, such as a myocardial infarction or a stroke, but it's defined as an event which permanently alters the patient's health, requires major surgical or medical intervention, or prolongs the hospital stay for more than 3 days, just because this is also very important. The patient wasn't decannulated, so that decannulation section is not open there. And now we have some questions on the communication or one-way valve. So the patient did have a one-way valve to aid communication, and did have this. So for example, if the patient had electrolarynx, we can enter that there. And more details about did they utilize the one-way valve with the ventilator and communication. So patient and family education is so essential, so we've included this section here. So you can specify that education was provided prior and after insertion of the tracheostomy, equally important. Which date was the education provided? So let's say that was firstly done prior to insertion, say on the 17th. And it was verbal discussion and written commands. And the disciplines involved were nursing, physiotherapy, and speech pathology. The education was given to the patient and the family or caregiver, and topics copied were communication and nutrition. So we also have a section on discharge info, and whether they have home nursing and tracheostomy team support. And this is quite amusing, actually. So if you click possible, And you can see. So sometimes our programmers have a sense of humor as well. Don't worry, this will not be in the final expanded database. But we just threw it in there, just whilst we're editing. Anyway, we also have an end-of-life section and any additional further information. And our patient has now developed their love for koalas a bit further to those who surf and get piggybacks from kangaroos, like you see in all the touristy places in Australia. Anyway, but yeah, thank you very much. We can label this as complete or incomplete, depending if you want to come back. But we'll do incomplete for now and save it. Great.
So I think it's clear that if you use the GTC database, that you will feel sexy. And more importantly, you will know it. So in essence, if you use the GTC database, you'll be sexy and you will know it. So that was a whirlwind tour of the database, all right? It's a lot to think about and a lot to digest. We're happy to field any questions that you may have about it now, if you have some. Also, Hannah and I are welcome to meet with you during the breaks. We can sit down with you and pull up the computer and go through things together. And if you would like to email as well, any suggestions that you might have or follow up to talk more about things, we're happy to do it. The beauty of this is that as things expand, the world is our oyster in terms of figuring out what data we want to put into this thing and what we prioritize to do. And, let's develop a queue and let's put things in order and try to make it happen. So we definitely want input from everybody in terms of how to make that happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Hannah. We've got the opportunity for questions. Does anyone have any burning issues that they'd like to query? The microphone's...
It's Doug Bryan. It's got to be a button. I've got a very loud voice. I'm Doug Bryan, pediatrician at Children's Hospital in Melbourne. Thanks, Joe and Hannah. Great presentation, terrific work. We've been looking at some of our information about some of our patients, particularly complicated patients, and many of them have tracheostomies, but not all. Recently, as part of a project, we're trying to improve care for this sort of patient, not specifically these patients, but this sort of patient. And one of our patients had 7 documents that could be cared for either a care plan or a database contemporarily, and none of them talk to one another. So I guess my question is, does this database talk to other databases? Now, Joe, you made reference to it. I'm sure you're going to say yes, but I really need reassurance. Because I know it's going to be really difficult to introduce something like this in my institution, because we've got, right now, the beginnings of a 2-year project to get EPIC, the famous North American electronic medical record, come to that hospital. The hospital's spending $50 million to have that happen. If this doesn't talk to EPIC, it'll be really difficult to get it up in my institution.
Thanks, Doug. Fantastic questions and topic. So making this thing plug and play with every electronic health record that's out there, all existing data collection, is a huge undertaking. But we hope that the way the database has been constructed, and when you actually whittle down to the actual cells of data that are going into here, if we've done it in a way where it's basic enough, then we do think there's going to be some compatibility with existing things. We've had some sites already who've signed up to join and are contributing data that have collected a lot of these data in their way, and we're working with them about the source of their data, what exactly data elements they've got, what's the quality of those data elements, are they numeric values, are they characters, like down to that level, what it's actually being collected, and how can we do data dumps into this data set. And if there has to be work to merge or to get that to be going, let's talk and figure out if we can make it work. There's so much like that, I think, ongoing. Most places in the world, I think, that are leading the field aren't starting from scratch like this. They've got data, and if we can figure out how to make it work in the database, then we're all for it, and we believe that that can happen to some degree.
You said it was a whirlwind tour and it was, and it looks fantastic. Is there somebody set and the expanded data set written down somewhere so that I can actually take that back to the organisation and say, this is the database, these are the data points which we want to try and get, because my writing skills just work faster.
Absolutely. So we can work with you and get you a data dictionary that has every data element, a definition of it, what type of data is going to go into that element. And we can give you a little test username and password so you can go to the site and go into a little test database and kind of work through it so that you guys can talk about it, see what you think, and give us feedback on it too when you do it. Great.
And just to add to that, the instructions for logging in to the mandatory database is all in your handbooks. So everyone here can go and have a go at home. But that only gives you access to the core or mandatory data set. It doesn't actually have the expanded because that's still in draft form.
What do you use as your unique patient identifier? Because we have people that move across facilities, across sort of health boundaries, and there is no unique identifier.
Right. So the unique identifier, for every record that's sort of imputed into the database, you have sort of a random number digit identifier that occurs that's for that particular patient. And in these special circumstances like that, we're trying to figure out a way to integrate with the sites to have some type of system where you'd be able to track it. It may be site-specific in some ways, but we realize there are going to be situations like that we've got to overcome, and not just by logging into the data set are you assuming that this patient is actually unique. There may be more work to be done on that.
I think one of the things, Jay and Hannah have been very modest, but one of the remarkable achievements of this database is to have it working across multiple international jurisdictions, across multiple different platforms that can be accessed from any web-enabled device that you can carry in your pocket, your lab coat sleeve, or carry around in a cart or have it at a desktop, which is a remarkable undertaking. One that achieves all currently recognised international regulatory requirements for data sharing and can meet the needs of experienced allied health practitioners, ear, nose and throat surgeons, intensivists, number crunching data analysts and the like. This is an incredibly tall order, and I think you'll agree with the demonstration that Hannah provided. It's to achieve all of that and still be a remarkably intuitive and user-friendly system. To learn this, I think, will be relatively straightforward. And the mandatory data set can be completed in a couple of minutes, even by people that haven't been terribly experienced in this sort of undertaking before. So I think to achieve all this is quite a considerable outcome. Prue.
Sorry, we have a question here. The question is whether or not patients are able to access the database and whether or not they're able to contribute if they've found a solution to a problem, whether they're able to contribute to the database themselves.
It's a fantastic question. And I think in our thinking about this, we anticipate that people of all kinds are going to enter in data like this. And we would definitely, I think most of the discussions have been mostly from the clinician side of things to put in data, but having a conversation emerge about patients themselves actually putting up their outcomes into it, we would love to engage in that conversation and continue the dialogue with it. It's a wonderful question.
From a practical level, for people that are entering into the database, who is actually taking that time to put it in and enter the data and follow up and make sure it's completed?
Right. It's variable across sites. Some sites, they may have resources where they've got a quality improvement person or a research assistant type person to go in and do it with some oversight. That's probably the least likely scenario of most sites. Other folks tend to have a champion. So maybe it's the surgeons who are being the champion, or it's the ICU that's being the champion, sort of, or overseeing it and making things happen. But over time, some sites, it seems like, are kind of distributing things, like we kind of talked about a little bit in the presentation, where anesthesia may put in a few things, and then the surgeons put in a few things, the ICUs put in a few things. And it's sort of a collective effort with someone sort of on top of it at the end, making sure they feel like they don't have any missing data, and they've put it all in. Sometimes respiratory therapists are putting in stuff. It can be variable, just depending on who's available and what the setup of your team is like, and who wants to do it.
I think that's a key point, as Tony Narula touched on. We're not here to tell you how to do it at your site. Every site will find its own unique solution to these problems, and the database has been designed with those issues very much in mind, because what will work brilliantly at one site with an established team may not be an appropriate solution for a site down the road or across town.
Hello, sorry, I'm Jo Purger from Calvary Mater, Newcastle. We are an oncology hospital, but we don't have any ENT. John Hunter, our sister hospital, has the ENT, so the patients have their trachees put in there, then come to us for their treatment. So how does that work when we've got two facilities? We're actually a public-private enterprise and the other is a public hospital, so we're not actually under the same umbrella in the sense of costing and things like that. How would this sort of system work in relation to us sharing information? Because we have to at the moment, obviously, because the patients stay under ENT, but then come to our hospital under the radiation oncology or whatever it is.
Got it. Interesting.
We're pretty complex.
Right. Well, yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I think a partnership would probably be needed, for the folks there to enter in some data, because if the patients don't survive the discharge, then they're not going to make it to you.
So would that mean both hospitals would have to come on board for that to happen?
They may.
Because,
However,
we're not under the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Unless you thought, sure, let's say a partnership could not happen. You still may be able to track tracheotomy complications that occur during that index hospitalization by just asking about what happens. Or it may be that once the data become available, more the longitudinal follow-up for the patients, right, way after the index hospitalization occurs, and all of those data, where you're not going to need those guys as much, maybe, to follow the patients over time, track their health outcomes, et cetera, and you can control and be more on top of that, where a partnership might not be needed. So we definitely anticipate follow-up data and those things to be built over time. Maybe something like that would work for you guys.
Thank you.
One general comment I made, we don't want to dive too deeply into specifics, but the general comment is we're extremely open to making custom arrangements to help anybody who wants to join in and do the work. And we've made some custom arrangements with certain people already.
Hi there. I'm just wondering about extrapolating data and how the reports might come out for benchmarking for your own site and against others, just how it comes out.
You've got it.
I saw the report little tab there. I'm just interested in that.
Yes. Yes. So, you can it's set up where you can take all the data down for yourself into a CSV file, Excel file, a SAS file, something that you can take in your own institution and analyze all of it yourself. So that's one way of doing it. The other is going to be these standardized reports. And we're now going through the process of what those are actually going to be, and the sites are all kind of weighing in on what they want to see and how they'll look. But ultimately, we see sort of run chart type stuff with an outcome over time, prevalence of an outcome, time on the x-axis, that type of thing. And then, some color coordinated thing for a benchmark that maybe the collaborative sets together, and then where your hospital falls within that. And if we're powered to do it, again, we're hoping to be able to case mix adjust, where it's not, you'll see your crude rate of whatever it is, tracheostomy complication versus the benchmark. But if we're able to case mix adjust that, then you do have some type of variance around that point estimate. You've got a 95% confidence interval or a standard deviation or something that helps let you know truly if your performance really is the same, different, above, below, sort of what's happening. So that's kind of what we anticipate for the reports. Yeah.
That was the same question.
Thank you. Andrea Durrett from Eastern Health. I just wondered, are you able to download just one patient's information for it to go in their patient history, and also for it to go with the patient on discharge?
Explain a bit more about what you mean by download.
So if you're entering the data on a patient, that you can actually, once it's a completed record, you can actually download it into a PDF file or something for it to go in the patient's history and for them to have a copy for their own record? Are people doing that?
Well, we haven't thought about it.
We will look into that.
So yeah. All right. So taking the data and actually using it for health record information, like putting it back into the record. Like, this is what happened to this patient during the hospitalization. You've got a synopsis of the patient. It's brilliant. We should talk more. Okay, thanks very much for your time.
Let me make a couple of non-programming, non-geeky, high-level comments about the database and about data. Jay was talking about case mix adjusting, and that may be very familiar to some of you, but some of you may be like me that you didn't know what that was a year ago. Initially, when you put a year's worth of data in and a bunch of other hospitals put a year's worth of data in, you'll be able to compare yourself to other hospitals. We have a 5% mortality. The average hospital has a 2% mortality. We're higher than average. Until we have enough patients in the database to risk adjust based on all their different comorbidities, you won't really know if you're above or below average, if that's good or bad. And the process of getting enough patients in the database to determine that if patients have this this set of comorbidities, their expected mortality is this, or their expected complication rate is that, is going to be a bit of a longer process. And to get to the point where we're able to say to our member hospitals, you have more complications than average based on your case mix, and that truly means that you probably are not doing as well as you could. That's a little further, that's going to happen, but it's a little further away. Is that clear? 3 very high-level principles about the database and about the data, because you will find when you go back to your institution, some institutions really have no problems with this, but some institutions, the data becomes a huge sticking point. And your CEO may be very, very concerned that your hospital is going to look bad, frankly. So the first principle is we will never publish, analyze, report internally, or otherwise present data to anybody in a way that allows you to be identified. That includes removing the n number of cases and error bars and so forth. There's going to be a small number of people on the steering committee who will have to have access to decode who is hospital 1, who is hospital 2 in order to generate the reports. But I myself as a policy level decision, I'm never going to have internal access to which hospital is who. If you have terrible outcomes and we meet at a cocktail party, I won't know that. Secondly, if you have great outcomes and we meet at a cocktail party, I won't know that either, but you could tell me if you want to. Secondly, the legal ownership of your data, and this is spelled out in your data use agreement, is yours. The data belongs to you. You are free to bring it, to download it, and do anything you want with it. Analyze it, report it internally, publish papers about your experience. Party. We're all in favor. The data belongs to you and will always belong to you. However, once you enter it in the database, we cannot guarantee we can disentangle it, and you will be giving us an irrevocable right to analyze, report, and publish in anonymous aggregate form. And if you say to us after 5 years of belonging, we want to quit the collaborative and we want you to erase all our data, we actually can't guarantee we can do that. That's harder than you would think. So the first rule is you'll be anonymous. The second is your data belongs to you. And the third rule is once you put it in there, we have the right to analyze it and look at it in anonymized form. Great.
Thanks, David. So those of you who've been playing with your little lanyards will notice that there is an entire outline of the sessions today in there. Those of you who are paying extra special attention will notice that we've changed the program ever so slightly to accommodate our next guest speaker. Michael Bremer has literally just arrived, hot off the plane from the US. So go slightly easy with him. He's still adjusting to our Antipodean climate. he's been a fabulous collaborator to work with in the GTC, and Michael will be sharing with us the perspective of an ENT surgeon from North America about tracheostomy in the US. Thanks very much, Michael.
And yes, our hospital uses Epic too. Don't hate me for it. Terrific. Well, so that's actually a hard act to follow as far as the database. That's the first time that I've actually seen the expanded version of it, and it's spectacular. For those of you who that was your first introduction to it, I think it is important to emphasize that the mandatory component of it is very manageable. It truly is a couple of minutes, but there was also a demand and an interest to go above and beyond that, and it's really, really spectacular to see the deliverable. So with respect to my talk, it's partially personal, it's partially a broader perspective from the U.S., but I would just like to say that I can't tell you how honored I am to be given the opportunity to speak at this event, because I think you take the Australasian launch of the Global Tracheostomy Collaborative combined with the International Tracheostomy Symposium, and I think that what we really have here is the premier forum in the world on best practices and innovation in tracheostomy. So I'd like to tip my hat to the conference organizers who've worked tirelessly to make this possible. This is the University of Michigan Health System. That's where I work and live. I'm a reconstructive surgeon, scientist, and a teacher. And at the University of Michigan, we've invested no small amount of effort into developing safer protocols for airway management and improving tracheostomy safety. And we're very proud that we were one of the early adopters for the Global Tracheostomy Collaborative. And so we've been very motivated by some of our other early adopters in North America, thought leaders like Harvard and Hopkins, who I think are represented in this room today, and several others. But even more impactful has been the global component of that, which has spanned from London to Singapore to Qatar, but particularly here in Melbourne, Australia. So I was truly amazed and humbled when I saw and began to learn what TRAMS, the Tracheostomy Review and Management Services team had accomplished. It's not so much that they're at the leading edge of this bell curve, it's that they're not even on the curve. They're basically some 3 or more standard deviations from the mean in terms of having optimized their protocols. So I'm somewhat humbled to be here talking about our own perspective. I'd like to share a little bit about my own journey. So I've been interested in tracheostomies and patient safety since I was a medical student. And that was in the 1990s, which was kind of an exciting time because the modern patient safety movement was just starting to develop some traction. The Institute of Medicine had put forth to err as human, and many people were starting to really look critically at the number of adverse events across medicine. And tracheostomy care was one area that was a particular outlier. So when this really sunk in, what really catapulted upon my personal consciousness was when it involved a patient of my own. So a very gifted head and neck surgeon that I worked with invited me to partner with him in a complex case, a patient who had a very invasive mandibular tumor that was basically eroding the jawbone, the surrounding soft tissue and musculature. And basically he was going to remove this with a composite resection, provide the tracheostomy, and then my job was to basically make this patient whole again. And so he was a late middle-aged gentleman, tough kind of, but really likable kind of salt of the earth guy, a farmer, still working. And so my colleague performed this extensive resection, and actually looking after the fact of the pathology did a great job. I think he actually got his scalpel around every cell of cancer in this patient's body. And then I did a complex reconstruction. There was a transplantation type procedure, microvascular free flap, where we took bone, muscle, skin, tissue from the leg, wired up the arteries, veins, nerves, and so forth, and also used some musculature from the chest. And he actually did great in those first few days. So 3 days out, we were looking at a discharge ahead of schedule, planning to remove his tracheostomy in coming days and so forth. But then we got one of these calls that sends chills down the spines of anyone who takes care of patients, that comes at about 2, 3 in the morning, that something has gone terribly wrong. And what had happened in this patient was that his trach had come out, he coughed it out, and there had been many attempts to put it back in. There was bleeding at the trach site, but more prominently there was subcutaneous emphysema, so the neck swelled up. The patient went into respiratory distress, had coded, and eventually they did get him back. They got his heart back, but they lost the man because he suffered a severe anoxic brain injury, and ultimately the family ended up withdrawing support. And so when they called me, actually, it wasn't so much for my medical advice as to talk to the family about this. And in my own effort to get a root cause analysis, there were some really quite disquieting truths that emerged that I think we can all relate to and have seen. So one of these was that the ICU was extremely short-staffed, so much so that they pulled a nurse from the other side of the hospital who had never cared for a patient with a tracheostomy. And so this individual was absolutely shell-shocked in the wake of this event. The intern was a hard-working general surgery intern who wanted to be strong, wanted to do the right thing, but at the end of the day didn't have the wherewithal to handle this as the first responder. The anesthesia team is a critical part, and I think that they really would have made a difference had they been available. And it's amazing how they can be 2 places at once, but perhaps not 3, because there was a neurosurgical emergency, a cesarean section, and they just couldn't get out of the operating room in time. And then there was confusion about the patient's anatomy. So he actually had a thin neck, similar to mine, but there was a thought that maybe he had had a total laryngectomy, and so no attempt was made at an orotracheal intubation, intubating him through his mouth, which probably would have been life-saving. And then finally, there was a breakdown in communication. So one of my first questions was, why wasn't I called sooner? And as it happened, the initial call went out to the name of the surgeon who was on the chart, which was my colleague who had removed the cancer, who was actually out of town at a conference, and to anesthesia. And only significantly later did a call go out to the attending surgeon that was on call, and myself as well, at which point the die was pretty much cast. So looking at this is actually pretty hard to explain to a patient's family. It's hard to explain to ourselves, and it's an opportunity to improve. And it really points to the need for systems, because at any point along this pathway, a different course of actions would have likely averted this catastrophic outcome. So we owe a great debt to James Reason, who made many important contributions to patient safety and human factors engineering, the best known of which is the Swiss cheese model of adverse event causation. And he basically posits that one error is probably not enough to lead to a major adverse event. It probably takes several. There are a combination of latent errors and errors of omission and commission within the system, as well as within the practitioners, that ultimately culminate in the adverse event. So the optimist would say there are actually a great many opportunities to improve, to make care less fragmentary, and to avoid this sort of outcome. So that's really the impetus for change, in my personal view, and I think it's one that many of us can relate to. And so if you're going to improve something, you have to study it. And part of this is establishing a just culture that balances personal accountability with complex systems. So the American Academy of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, has a committee, the Patient Safety and Quality Improvement Committee, that embarked upon an effort to really better understand the scope and breadth of this problem. And I don't have time today to talk about all this work, but these were 4 seminal papers, some out of that committee, others out of other collaborating committees, that helped delineate the extent of the problem. So I'll focus on this one study, because I think that some of the data in it is quite telling. So it was a survey of otolaryngologists throughout the country, and the goal was to basically look at experience with tracheostomy-related complications. The respondents were members of our academy, and it was basically a survey-based method in which we collect data and evaluated it qualitatively and quantitatively to capture these sorts of catastrophic events. And so the most common incidents involved decannulation, similar to the case that I described, or obstruction. And more commonly, it was in the setting of an accidental decannulation with loss of airway or a false passage, but also during planned tracheostomy changes in the setting of false passage, loss of airway, or stenosis. Bleeding was the second most frequent cause of major complications arising from carotid artery erosions or volume bleeds. And then tube occlusions or mucus plugs were the next most frequent with an N of 57. Breaking these down, we looked at some of the instances because sometimes the stories are more revealing than just the numbers. So there were 29 cases specified to be children, of which approximately half were fatal. One example is a child with a T-tube style trach who was found deceased on the floor moments before they were about to be taken home. A 9-month-old child with a chronic trach occluded with a mucus plug that was suctioned by the nurse. That was unsuccessful. The patient expired. Or accidental decannulation at home of an infant with a ventilator dependence who suffered hypoxia resulting in brain death. So these are terrible events, and these are really the sorts of things that we would like to make not happen anymore or eradicate as much as possible. Obesity was an important factor. Nearly 50% mortality was seen with critical trach events. In one case example, a trach was placed for OSA in a morbidly obese patient. He presented to the emergency department with extrusion, obstructing on sedation, and not able to be intubated. And then there were also events that pertain to positioning, patient transfer, trach changes. The first example is a patient with Guillain-Barré who was decannulated accidentally during bed bath and unable to be intubated and expired. Another was a patient being cared for by a nurse in a long-term acute care hospital where the trach tube was dislodged, the patient coded, and died. So there are a great many examples. It's a very rich study in terms of the amount of data that we can capture in terms of the specific instances, and it gets very granular. In this case, where we look at trach education, I think this second example is particularly telling. Home care for a long-term trach in an 8-year-old with subglottic stenosis, mucus plug. Uncle was caring for the child, didn't know how to suction, and the patient died. Or the one before it, where actually the patient was on the way home from the hospital, and actually the suction equipment was in the trunk, and they couldn't get it out in time. So the conclusions that came from this were that there are a wide range of tracheostomy complications. They're pervasive. The vast majority occur greater than 1 week after the procedure. And the key point here is that many are preventable. And I was really struck when we had our European kickoff in London that this really mirrored what was seen in other countries as well. The NC-POD, which I don't know if was covered earlier, was a comprehensive national study that found very similar types of outcomes. So we're all struggling with and grappling with the same things, and the hope is that we can share many of the same solutions. So these are the key drivers for improving care in the Global Tracheostomy Collaborative. These may have been covered in some form, I'm sure. I'll cover them very briefly, except to say that truly multidisciplinary care is absolutely critical. If you have 4 different services running at 4 different times, that's not the same thing as integrated care. Institution-wide protocols really mean that people are dealing with the same playbook within an institution, even though across institutions these may differ. Comprehensive staff education was the topic of a recent webinar for GTC. And patient and family involvement is really the touchstone of what we do, because if it's not relevant to patients and to their family, then it's not real. And I was really enlightened in some of the insights that we have obtained from our patient advocates. And one example was with industry relations, which I had a natural tendency to perhaps want to distance ourselves from that. But one of the discoveries was that if you have a child with a tracheostomy and the suction doesn't work, that's about the scariest thing in the world. And in order to fix that sort of issue, you have to have communication and a relationship with industry. If an insurer doesn't allow for a trach care nurse who provides necessary care for your patient, then if you don't have an interaction with those providers, then you can't work to improve the system. And then finally, data collection and benchmarking. And this is really where it gets more granular in the sense that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So in order to know what's really working, the database becomes really absolutely critical. And I was really delighted to see the engagement and thoughtful questions after the last talk. So GTC is really about working towards a larger vision where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Each of us is going to bring something different to the table. We're all disparate in our own ways, but the collective vision is that GTC really represents a learning community where we share our outcomes and we make discoveries together. And it's also about patient-centered care. And as a surgeon, it's, we like to think of ourselves as rugged individuals and tough, but really we need to work together. And this rainbow of colors is different countries. It's also different disciplines that all work together to achieve the goal of improving care. And so integrating these two visions is really putting the patient at the center of everything that we do and sharing from our collective experiences. So I'll just close now with something that was shared with me from George Lundberg, who was he was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Medical Association when I was a medical student and had the fortunate opportunity, I was in Chicago at the time, to work with him as a student editor. And so this was part of what they term the patient-physician covenant, but it's really a provider-patient covenant. Anyone who's involved with patient care, I believe, should embrace this. Medicine is at its center a moral enterprise grounded in a covenant of trust. We are both intellectually and morally obliged to act as advocates for the sick wherever their welfare is threatened and for their health at all times. And so I think the point here is I can't think of patients that are more vulnerable than our patients who've undergone tracheostomy. And this is one area where we can really rally together and improve their care. So finally, I'll close with this quote from Vance Havner. The vision must be followed by the venture. It's not enough to stare up the steps. We must step up the stairs. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Don't run away. We've got a couple of minutes to maybe share some of the thoughts that you may be having at this point. We've presented a great deal of content thus far. We've got a couple of minutes that we'd perhaps be interested in hearing from you. I think one of the themes that strongly emerged, which is I'm sure resonant with you, is that most of the bad things that happen to the patients we care for are preventable, and that the interventions are often dramatically simple. It's the systems that are complex and the coordination that's challenging. So I'd be very interested in some of your own thoughts on those issues or any others that you might need to raise. Well, I've got Michael up at the podium. They're starstruck, Michael, I assure you. I'll ask you, Michael, what are some of the simple things that you've introduced in your centre? I mean, you described some pretty challenging scenarios there. That those patient stories are pretty challenging to us as clinicians. I think we can all empathise with how those issues must have felt for you as a senior clinician, and especially getting a call after the fact. What was the priority after that event to sort of start the change? You sort of felt very inspired, but what was the first thing that you undertook?
Yeah, well, so that event actually occurred when I was at a much smaller hospital in Southern Illinois. The actual hospital was community-based, and they really struggled with fragmentation of care, perhaps not to the same degree that a much larger healthcare system does. However, many of them have similar challenges. So to answer the question, what was the low-lying fruit? What were the things that we could begin to do? There were a number. One was educating family, really getting them engaged early. recognizing when there was a problem. Because actually, in this particular patient's case, looking back, there were actually indications that this trach was working its way out well before it got to be the middle of the night. Understanding that the patient actually can play a very significant role in their own safety as well if they can communicate. Getting earlier speech pathology engagement, passing mirror valves can be very helpful. Bringing the team together, I mean, it really comes down to those 5 drivers that I presented. And the question isn't really which one is important, because they all are. It's more which one can you start with first. And that's going to be very individual and cultural, I think, from one institution to the next.
Sure. Thanks very much. If we don't have any further questions, we might move to our wrap-up. Thank you very much, Michael. So we've got 5 minutes before lunch, and David Robertson will kindly wrap up for us. Just before David comes to the podium, can speakers and members of the GTC committee meet us immediately outside in the foyer for a very, very, very short meeting before lunch? Thanks very much, David.
Those of you who are following your program will know that I'm Professor Tony Narula, wrapping up on the morning. Thank you for joining us today. One of the things I haven't realized till just a minute ago, the brilliance of having 2 different meetings, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, that is that the organizational committee gets 2 rounds of applause. Can we thank the organizational committee, please? Next time I run a meeting, I'm going to do that also. Even though much of what we said may be familiar to some of you, I hope it's been helpful. I hope there's been some learning for everyone, and I hope it's been helpful, even if all of it was familiar to you, to understand that you're part of a community and that we can work together on these things. I'm at an institution similar, and my experience is similar to what Haitham described earlier. I'm at an institution that prides itself on being one of the best pediatric hospitals in the world, and if you had asked me 5 years ago, would have said that there was probably little, if anything, we could do to improve our tracheostomy care. But you know, it's interesting what you don't know until you dig into it. I mean, for example, I didn't know in the 20 years that I've been performing the operation until I joined this group, I didn't know it was spelled with an S. And once we started doing research on tracheostomy complications, and once I started reading the papers from Tony's group at St. Mary's, the TRAMS group here, Johns Hopkins has been publishing some very good stuff. And once I started reviewing our adverse event reports at our hospital and thinking back on the things that, in the past we've said, well, that's very unfortunate, but not much we could have done, it becomes clear actually that we have a long way to go. We've actually had some huge quality improvement initiatives in the last couple of years, led by a couple of my partners, Dr. Waters and my associate chief, Dr. Ibarra, who unfortunately aren't with us, and have made great strides, but we have a long, long way to go. And I'm going to just engage in a little personal reflection here and encourage you to think about whether the things I say make sense for you or not. I cannot predict the future in detail. I don't know what days in the coming year it's going to rain, but I know it's going to rain. And similarly, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that if I go home, and if myself and my partners and respiratory and pulmonary, what you would call physio and respiratory, if we keep doing everything the exact same way we've been doing, which frankly is pretty good, I can guarantee with absolute certainty that at some point during the next few years, we're going to have a terrible event, and we've had some in the past. We're going to have another one. I don't know if it's going to be next year or 5 years from now, but it's going to happen, it's certain. And that family will then have to bury their child. And we'll have to get up tomorrow morning and look at ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves if we did everything we could have to prevent that. One thing we've learned today is that if I go home and resolve to be a much better doctor, to dictate better notes, to answer all my phone calls within a minute, to give patients, spend more, an extra half hour with every patient educating them, the impact of that's going to be really quite minimal. Because the problem is not that the pieces of our puzzle aren't good, the problem is our pieces are not fitting together well. And if we want to save that child's life and to spare that family and our clinicians that horrible event, we're going to have to work together as a team. It's going to require some people changing the way they do things. And while everybody would like things to be better, people don't always they would like things to be better as long as they don't have to change. It's going to be a process, and it's going to take a number of years. And because I don't know if that event is going to happen a year from now or 6 years from now, what I do know is the sooner we get to work, the better chance we have of saving that child. I really hope, and I really hope you will consider and will join the GTC, and I truly believe that you've got a better chance, and we've got a better chance of preventing that event as part of a group, as part of a team, as part of a collaboration. But when all is said and done, the GTC is a means to an end, and the end is better care for our patients. What I hope most of all is that every one of us commits to going home and getting to work. Thank you for your attention.